I am a 26-year-old who lives with my parents in a home that I fully pay for. Although this may sound rather simple, it's actually much more intricate than it seems. Let me start from the beginning. Last year, I purchased a home in the city. I pay for everything: food, all the bills, and the entire mortgage. Not a single penny is paid by my parents, Liz 55 and Tom 55, both retired teachers. It wasn't a case of moving back home because I couldn't afford rent. I'm a software developer and earn a decent living. I actually chose to live with them to be nearer to employment options in the city, and because I felt it would be nice to return the favor after they had supported me for so many years. The house is a pleasant three-bedroom home. It's nothing fancy but comfortable. I took the master bedroom because I pay for everything. It has its own bathroom and a walk-in closet, which is a huge plus because I absolutely hate sharing a bathroom. Since I spend about 80 of my time working from home, I set up my office in the second bedroom, complete with two monitors, a comfortable chair, and all the supplies I need. The third bedroom is kept as a guest room. Everything was great at first. While I worked and took care of the house, my parents, who were glad to be in the city, went about their own business. Since they were my parents and I felt good about supporting them after everything they had done for me, I didn't mind paying the bills. However, things changed when my mother casually dropped a bombshell. She said that my older brother Jake 20 and his wife Emma 26 were considering relocating to the city. She added that they had been having difficulties and that Emma was pregnant. They really need the help, she said. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured if Jake and Emma moved here, they'd find a tiny apartment nearby. But they have a history of jumping from one bad situation to another, so things quickly took an unexpected turn. A few days later, my mother sat me down and, in her most innocent voice, told me that Jake and Emma had been invited to stay with us only temporarily, she said, until they got back on their feet. They didn't ask if I was comfortable with this. No, they informed me after they had already extended the invitation. Sure enough, Jake and Emma showed up, luggage in hand, obviously intending to stay indefinitely. As soon as they moved in, it was clear they had no intention of leaving. I was already anxious about the additional costs. Now I had two more people to support and no one had even asked how I felt. I was paying for everything: groceries, utilities, the mortgage, etc. Although I like my brother, Jake is not the most responsible person. He always seems to get himself into situations where everyone else has to bail him out. Emma, on the other hand, seems decent enough, but I don't like her entitled attitude, which makes me feel like everyone should take care of her just because she's pregnant. The tension started to rise almost immediately. Emma began making remarks that at first seemed innocent enough but quickly became bothersome. For example, "This place is so big, it must be hard for you to clean it all by yourself," or "When the baby stuff arrives, we're going to need a lot of space." At first I ignored these comments, but things started to escalate. One evening Jake and Emma called me aside and said they needed to have a conversation. I thought they were either going to offer some financial assistance or apologize for the strain they were placing on me. But no. "We've been thinking," Emma began in a relaxed tone, "it would make more sense if we took the master bedroom." Jake interrupted, adding, "Yeah, the baby's going to need a lot of stuff, and your room has the walk-in closet and private bathroom." I blinked, thinking I might have misheard. Let me remind you, these two were sitting in my living room, recommending that I give up my own room for them and their unborn child, even though I'm the one paying for everything. I was struck with boldness and said, "Why don't you just take the guest room? It's quite large, and it still has plenty of space." Emma looked at me as if I had just made a ridiculous suggestion. "There isn't a walk-in closet in that room," she stated. "The baby will need room." At that point I was done. "I refuse to give up my room. You can either find another place to stay or use the guest room, but you're not taking my room," I said, maintaining my composure. Jake was somewhat taken aback, as if he was surprised that I wasn't just going to give in. Emma, however, was blatantly insulted. That's when I realized things were not going to work out. Things quickly started to spiral. Jake and Emma seemed to make themselves more and more at home. Their belongings were everywhere: baby magazines scattered across the dining table, shoes kicked off by the couch. Emma even started talking about where the crib should go, as though she had already decided they'd be staying in the master bedroom. One day I had to attend a meeting in my office, and when I returned, the house was strangely quiet. No one tried to argue with me or knock on my door. They must have finally realized I wasn't going to back down. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. First update. The following day I was hoping for a dramatic outburst, or for everyone to finally take me seriously once I handed out the eviction papers. Instead, there was an uncomfortable silence in the house. I woke up earlier than usual, expecting some kind of intervention, maybe my parents trying to persuade me or knocking on my door to insist I change my mind. But none of that happened. The house was deserted. When I walked into the kitchen, no one was there: no parents, no Emma, and no Jake. I even wondered, wishful thinking, if they had packed up and left in the middle of the night. I waited, but no one said anything. I sat at the table and made my coffee, not wanting to engage in small talk. I wasn't going to back down now. I had drawn my line in the sand. I couldn't continue living this way. They had pushed me too far and shown me no respect, and certainly no respect for the fact that I was footing the bill. My mother eventually entered the kitchen. She looked like she hadn't slept much. She grabbed a cup of coffee and sat across from me without saying a word. It was strange neither of us knew how to break the awkward silence. Finally, she spoke softly, her voice weary. "Honey, I know things have gotten out of hand." I stared at my coffee and waited for her to continue. I knew she would have to apologize in some way, but I wasn't going to let her off easily. She continued, her voice shaking slightly. "I didn't realize how bad things had gotten between you and your brother. I guess I didn't see how unfair it was to you. We were just trying to help them." I was surprised by this, at least surprised she admitted it so quickly. I briefly thought maybe she was starting to see things my way, but I couldn't shake my irritation with everything that had happened. With more force than I intended, I responded, "You didn't just ignore what I wanted, you always took his side, as if you thought I would give in and let them have whatever they wanted." She stared down at her coffee for a few seconds before responding. "I understand," she muttered. "But we reasoned that you've always been the more resilient one. Jake has never had it easy. He's struggled more since I thought you had your life together. It seemed like we could ask more of you." I could feel my rage building just beneath the surface. "You think I've had it easy? This house was purchased by me, the mortgage is paid by me, the groceries are paid by me. Do you really believe I can keep carrying you all indefinitely?" She nodded, groaning. "You are right. We couldn't have asked for anything more from you." She sighed. "But Jake," I interrupted, "the baby is not the point here. You haven't shown me any respect, and this is about that." She sighed again, this time more tiredly. "We believed we were acting appropriately," she said quietly. "Emma and Jake don't have much. Who's to blame for that?" I shot back. "I didn't ask them to move in. None of this was requested of me. You can't keep saving them by putting me in a bad position. They need to learn how to live their own lives." She seemed to finally comprehend, or at least try to, as she nodded. "We'll figure something out, but don't push us away, not in this way." I tried to relax and sat back. Since they were my parents, I didn't want to expel them, but I couldn't continue to live this way. "I don't want to push you out, but things have to change. I can't continue to be treated like I don't belong in my own home." She nodded silently without arguing. "All right," she said. "We'll find a solution." Then she walked out of the kitchen, leaving me to think alone. At least it seemed like they were starting to take me seriously. Whether or not things would change, I wasn't sure. Second update. I woke up early again the next morning, aware that today would be the day. Either Jake and Emma would leave. Oddly, I no longer felt angry. I didn't feel nervous either. The only thing left was to follow through on what I had already decided needed to happen. The house was eerily quiet when I woke up and went into the kitchen like the calm before a storm. Despite it still feeling empty from Jake and Emma's last grocery run, I managed to pull together a decent breakfast. As I ate, I reflected on how quickly things had spiraled. Just a few months ago, everything was fine. I was working, paying my bills, and life was good. But everything went haywire when Jake and Emma moved in. When people start feeling entitled to things they didn't earn, it's amazing how quickly everything can change. A few hours later, after entering the kitchen for a cup of coffee, my dad sat down across from me. He sipped his coffee and stared out the window, not saying anything at first. I couldn't tell if he was upset with me or just unsure of what to say. The silence was broken when he muttered, "Jake and Emma are leaving today." I took a moment to reply. Although I felt some guilt, I knew it was the right thing to do. They had plenty of time to get their act together, I said firmly. They gave me no other choice. My dad didn't argue. He just nodded and took another sip of his coffee. I could tell he was resigned to the situation, realizing that I wasn't backing down. We couldn't go back to the way things were. Jake and Emma packed their belongings by lunchtime. I stayed in my room, not wanting to hear any more passive-aggressive remarks or have another argument. I knew something was coming when I heard Jake's voice growing louder from down the hall. Sure enough, he knocked on my door. When I opened it, he was standing there with the same angry look he'd had the entire time. "Are you really going to do this?" he asked sternly. "You are just going to kick us out like this?" I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "I gave you a day, you knew what had to happen." Jake clenched his jaw, clearly trying to control his rage. "We're family. You don't treat family like this." I took a deep breath. "Family members don't exploit one another. For weeks you've done nothing but freeload. I've covered everything, the mortgage, the groceries, all of it. And then you tried to take my room. I won't allow that." Jake was silent for a few seconds. He clearly didn't want to acknowledge it, but deep down he knew I was right. "That's it then," he muttered, his voice quiet. "You were just dismissing us." I replied, "You have two choices: find somewhere else to stay, or respect my personal space and stay in the guest room, but you're leaving if you can't manage that." Jake gave me one last look and then turned, walking away without saying another word. By mid-afternoon, Jake and Emma were gone. I didn't want to watch them leave, so I stayed in my room. They packed their things, put them in their car, and drove away without a word. The house was quieter and less tense for the rest of the day. I didn't hear much from my parents, but I could tell they were processing everything. That night my mother knocked on my door. She entered and sat at the edge of my bed, looking down at the floor for a long time. It was clear she was struggling to find the right words. "They're gone," she whispered. I nodded without saying anything. "I never thought it would get to this point," she continued. "I didn't realize how much pressure we were putting on you." I felt some of the frustration begin to subside. I gazed at her and said, "It's not that I didn't want to help, but you treated me like my needs and personal space didn't matter." She nodded. "You were right. We should have noticed it sooner." For several minutes neither of us knew what to say. The silence hung in the air. Finally I broke it. "I don't want you and Dad to leave, but I can't live this way anymore. If things don't change, I'll have to leave." She stood up slowly and nodded. "We'll work it out. I promise things will be different." As she walked out of the room, I felt an odd mix of relief and exhaustion. There was still work to do with my parents, but the issue with Jake and Emma had finally been resolved. Even though it wasn't perfect, at least they were starting to listen. And for the first time in weeks I felt like I could breathe again. The strain that had been choking me was gone, and the house was peaceful. The apology hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized just how much I'd been holding in until she said those words. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to be frustrated. After all, this whole mess had started with their poor judgment and their assumption that I could just shoulder it all. But as she sat there vulnerable, not hiding behind excuses or defensiveness, it made me feel like something was shifting. Maybe I wasn't the only one who had been holding on to resentment. Maybe we were both stuck in a place where we didn't know how to fix things. I took a deep breath and let the tension ease out of my shoulders. I didn't want to make her feel worse, but I also needed to be honest. "You pushed me, Mom," I said softly, my voice more even than I thought it would be. "You pushed me into something that wasn't fair. You assumed I would just keep giving and giving, but I don't think you really saw how much I was sacrificing. I wasn't okay with it, but I didn't know how to say it. You and Dad never asked me how I felt about it, how it was impacting me. I was doing everything, and no one noticed." She nodded, her eyes brimming with something between guilt and understanding. "I see that now," she said quietly. "I should have asked. You were always so independent, always so calm and collected. I think I took that for granted." There was a long pause where neither of us said anything. I wasn't sure what she was feeling, but I could tell she was still processing everything, still feeling like she had failed me. I didn't know if things would ever go back to normal, but at least we were talking now. At least we were being honest. "I just want to feel respected in my own home," I said, my voice a little steadier. And I didn't feel like I was. I felt like I was the one who had to give up everything for everyone else, without anyone ever asking me if it was okay. My mom wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and I realized she was trying not to cry. I felt a pang of guilt in my chest. This wasn't easy for her. She was used to taking care of everyone, to holding everything together. And now she was starting to understand that I had my limits too. "I'm sorry," she whispered again. "I promise we'll make it right. Things will be different." I nodded, that I wasn't sure how much I could believe that yet. We had a long way to go before we could rebuild the trust that had been broken. But at least this was a step, a big one. The next few days were strange. The house was quieter than it had been in months, and I found myself still adjusting to the new dynamic. I didn't want to feel like I was walking on eggshells, but I also didn't want to pick fights. My parents were still in a bit of shock, still processing everything that had happened with Jake and Emma. I could see the tension in their eyes, and I could feel it in my chest too. But there was something else too, something more hopeful. Maybe it was the fact that we were all being honest with each other for the first time in a long while. Maybe we were finally going to start figuring things out. A week later, my dad sat down with me in the living room. He was unusually quiet, which was unlike him. He cleared his throat before speaking. "I've been thinking about everything that happened," he began. "And I realize that we weren't fair to you. We weren't fair in assuming you'd just handle it all, and we weren't fair to not consider how this was affecting your life. I don't want you to think you're alone in this. I'm sorry too, son." The words were simple, but they hit me differently than I thought they would. I hadn't expected this kind of acknowledgement from him. He had always been the silent provider, the kind of guy who worked hard and expected everyone to do the same. But this time he was looking at me like I was his equal, like he understood that I had needs and boundaries too. "I'm not mad at you," I said, my voice steady. "I just need things to change. I need to feel like my space, my life matters too." He nodded, looking relieved. "We'll figure this out. I know we've made mistakes, but we'll make it right." That night after dinner, my mom and dad both came to my room to talk. It felt like we were finally having the conversations we should have been having all along. They assured me they wouldn't try to fix things by pushing me too hard anymore. They wanted me to feel like I had a say in the decisions, And they understood now that it wasn't just about what they wanted, it was about what I needed to. That was when I realized that things weren't going to be perfect right away. They couldn't be. We had a lot of ground to cover, a lot of broken trust to rebuild. But the fact that they were acknowledging their mistakes, that they were finally seeing me, meant everything. It wasn't a sudden fix, but it was a shift that gave me hope. A month passed, and things gradually settled into a new rhythm. Jake and Emma stayed in a hotel for a while, then moved into a small apartment once they could afford it. They didn't come around much, which was fine by me. I didn't have any more energy to fight with them. Maybe they would learn something from all of this, maybe they wouldn't. But that wasn't my problem anymore. My parents, on the other hand, were trying. They were more mindful now, more aware of my space and my boundaries. They no longer took it for granted that I would do everything for them. We all started to communicate more openly, which felt strange at first but also incredibly necessary. I still paid for most of the household expenses, but now it felt like a choice, not an obligation. And when I got a little extra help with the groceries or the cleaning, it didn't feel like charity, it felt like partnership. There were still moments of tension, of course. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. We still had disagreements, and I still had to remind them that I wasn't just the family ATM or the silent support system. But we were getting better at listening to each other. I was getting better at asserting myself, and that was progress. One evening, a few weeks after Jake and Emma moved out, I was sitting in the living room scrolling through my phone when my mom walked in. She looked at me for a moment, and then, almost shyly, she spoke. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I don't want to take advantage of your kindness anymore. I want to help you, maybe." I looked up at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the same page. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was something real, something worth fighting for. And maybe that was enough. As I sat there, I couldn't help but feel a sense of calm settle over me. I had fought for my peace, and I was beginning to get it. Life would always throw challenges my way, but for now, at least, I had my space, my respect, and finally my voice.